Hello, my name is Carrie Cotton Williams, and I manage the DC Public Library's People's Archive, a department dedicated to preserving and providing access to the history and culture of Washington, DC. I'm here in the People's Archive on the 4th floor of the newly renovated Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. Please visit us virtually for now at Dig DC, which also is our repository for our online resources at digdc.dclibrary.org. I welcome you today to Sounds of the City, a Humanitini event celebrating the work of jazz and blues historians and WPFW DJs, Rusty Hassan and Bill Wax. This project was supported by a grant from Humanities DC as part of the Humanities Grant Program, an initiative funded by the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities. I'd like to introduce you to our host and our very good friend of the People's Archive and the library, Reverend Dr. Sandra Butler Truesdale. Sandra is a native Washingtonian, an ordained licensed minister at Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, DC, founder and chair of the DC Legendary Musicians Incorporated, producer of Don't Forget the Blues radio program on WPFW 89.3 FM, and co-author of the book Washington, DC Jazz. Please welcome Sandra Butler Truesdale.
Good evening. I'm Reverend Dr. Sandra Butler Truesdale, chair of the DC Legendary Musicians Incorporated. Welcome to the Sounds of the City, brought to you by the DC Legendary Musicians Incorporated in collaboration with the Martin Luther King Library in Washington, DC, Humanities DC, and WPFW FM Radio. The mission of the DC Legendary Musicians is to preserve, protect, educate, and promote the artistic legacy and well-being of the DMV's professional musicians and artists. This evening, we will promote the legacy of one of Washington, D.C.'s great music historians and longtime programmers, Mr. Rusty Hassan. Let me introduce you to my friend and colleague, the moderator of the Sound of the City's panel discussion and jam session, Mr. Willard Jenkins, jazz programmer for WPFW-FM radio.
Yes, good afternoon, Sandra, and thank you so much for hosting, you and the library for hosting this wonderful occasion where we are celebrating a rich legacy in this music we call jazz here in the DMV. I'm Willard Jenkins. As Sandra said, I'm a programmer at WPFW and have been for the last 30 years. I'm also the artistic director of the DC Jazz Festival and a writer, and have known the subject of our discussion for a number of years. I should say at this point that Rusty Hassan and I participated in a oral history project through Humanities DC that is the DC Jazz Festival Oral History Project, which is housed at the DC Public Library through our work with Humanities DC. So this is very apropos for the two of us to be on this particular discussion. I'd like to introduce our panelists. The gentleman that you see sitting in front of a blizzard of books with the glasses is Mr. Blair Ruble. And Blair Ruble is the co-editor of a wonderful book called DC Jazz. And Blair is also works at the Woodrow Wilson Center. The gentleman with the black vest and the glasses and the CDs in the background is Mr. Davy Yarborough. Davy is a saxophonist and an educator who has retired from a long and distinguished career of educating at Duke Ellington School of the Arts. But knowing Davy, he's not done with jazz education. I'm certain of that. He's got a lot of things happening. He and his wife, Esther, have put together a number of different initiatives in the jazz education area. The gentleman with the blue print shirt and the glasses and the distinguished looking beard is Mr. Ron Holloway. Ron is a tenor saxophonist extraordinaire and someone who I would refer to as one of Sonny Rollins' children, shall we say, of the tenor saxophone. I want to start by posing a question for each of you to respond to. And that's simply, when did you first hear Rusty Hassan on jazz radio?
First heard Rusty Hassan in the 1970s. And he very quickly became a very familiar voice in my household because my dad was an avid jazz collector. My dad had started collecting jazz albums around 1951. And I think he probably brought Rusty to my attention. So I've been hearing you a long time, Rusty.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And Blair, when did you first hear Rusty Hassan on jazz radio?
Yeah, I'm more of a newbie at this, and my wife and I discovered jazz in the early 90s, and DC was a great place to be because of wonderful musicians like some of the people here, and also because of the radio at the time. There were great shows, and Rusty was one of the people who opened our ears and opened our mind to the music in the 1990s. And then Rusty, about 10 years ago, Rusty and I started appearing at various events together after I had published A History of U Street. And I really got to know and admire Rusty even more after that.
You know, and I'd be remiss if I didn't remark that that book that I displayed earlier that you co-edited, DC Jazz, Rusty Hassan actually wrote the chapter in that book on jazz radio.
Absolutely.
Yes. And Davey, when did you first hear Rusty Hassan on the radio?
Radio. What? First and foremost, I've known Rusty so long. I don't know which one came first, but let's say I know it was definitely in the 70s, but I don't know whether it was WAMU or WPFW or whichever ones. He's been on so many different shows, and I also have a history with him because his daughter went to School Without Walls when I was there as a counselor. I mean, it's, let's just say a very, very long time, but definitely in the 70s.
Well, for the record, Rusty Hassan's jazz radio activities in this community have spanned over 50 years, beginning when he was an undergrad at Georgetown University and continuing at WAMU and then WDCU, which was the former station of University of District of Columbia, and which was Jazz 90, which was a jazz station. Jazz was the central part of what WDCU was about. But then when WDCU was sold by the University of District of Columbia to C-SPAN, Rusty was one of those who was able to shift to WPFW and has been there ever since. And so, you know, it's clear that all of us have been impacted by Rusty Hassan's broadcasting efforts, and all of us have taken note of one of the things that one of my former WPFW colleagues, Bob Daughtry, used to always say that as far as the kind of radio that Rusty and myself do at WPFW, there's two ways to look at it. Said you can either program or you can come in and just play tunes. And if you listen to Rusty Hassan, you know that Rusty Hassan truly programs, because when you listen to Rusty's programs, you get a sense of preparedness, a sense of kind of a thematic thread to what Rusty presents. And you're not listening to someone who's just pulling tunes from a library, but you're listening to someone who is actually programming. So I want to also ask each of you, what have been your ongoing impressions of Rusty's contributions, specifically to jazz radio in this community? And how do you see Rusty's work in jazz broadcasting impacting jazz music in our community?
Well, first of all, I would say that Rusty's contribution is very special. It's obvious that he is a fan of the music, and he would have to be classified as a historian, because you learn so much about jazz history when you tune into his program. I can't think of any major jazz figure that's appeared in the Washington, D.C. area that I didn't see him present in the club. I think I first saw you in Harold's Rogan Jar back in the 1970s when Buck Hill and Marshall Hawkins used to play there.
Absolutely.
And if I can maybe pick up on this, since I'm a newcomer and a little bit from the outside. Rusty, DC has a great jazz scene, but it's sometimes not really all as visible as it should be. And Rusty is one of the people who lure people into the scene. He knows it. Willard, what you said about his programs, he curates the programs. And as he's doing so, he's introducing people to the music, but he's also introducing people to DC because he knows it so well. And I think he's really a pivotal figure in the ecosystem of jazz in this community.
Well, you know, that's interesting that you mentioned jazz education, Blair, because those of us who have followed Rusty's programs know well that Rusty's program is actually part of the curriculum in the history of jazz and jazz appreciation courses that he's taught down through the years. And I know on a number of occasions I've listened to Rusty, and he's actually directed his students that, oh, this next piece is part of your final exam, or things of that nature. So Rusty is a jazz educator, you know, kind of a square root of jazz education when you think about what he brings radio wise, and the fact that he's an educator and he's bringing that education not only to the listeners, but to specifically to his students. And Davey, you as an educator, I'm sure can appreciate that aspect of what Rusty does.
I have been able to call on Rusty in so many different events, and anywhere from school, church, civic organizations, and he comes because when you call Rusty, you get the total jazz package. You get the total jazz and the jazz community package. So whatever I'm doing, if I'm doing gospel jazz, or if I'm doing bebop, tribute to Charlie Parker or John Coltrane, Rusty will either be there because he came, or be there because I've asked him. I said I need an MC to warm the audience up and draw them in. And like you said, what he does, he draws you into his shows, but he draws you into whatever session you're involved with him with. And not only does he send them, tell them that this song is going to be a part of your homework, but he's also saying part of your assignment is to go out and see this music live. He covers bringing people to the music. He covers talking about the music. You're talking about the lives in the music. It's just like I said, from you asked me how does he rate? When Calvin Jones had me when I first got to Fellow City College, Calvin used to drive me around and pick up instruments, and he'd have on AM radio and a little FM like Bill Mayhew or Felix Grant. Well, Rusty is the continuation of what you heard, the album Sound Till Midnight. There was always, not just like you said, not just playing, just like you, you know, you talk about what you're doing, you talk about what's going on. He gives you the full gamut.
What would you say is the importance of a broadcaster like Rusty? I'll ask each of you this. What would you say is the importance of a radio broadcaster like Rusty, who is not merely playing the latest recording by so-and-so artist and then back announcing or front announcing who it is he's playing, but who also brings a depth of knowledge about these artists, including personal connections. You know, like I never forget the story Rusty told me about how he first connected with Art Blakey and brought Art Blakey to his house for a midnight snack after a set. But, you know, what is it about listening to someone like Rusty, who you know has a personal stake in the music, who you know is not there collecting a salary, because we're volunteer radio programmers, but you recognize in the love that they have for the music and what they bring to the craft, you recognize a real personal connection. How important is that for you, the listeners?
Not only just the listeners, but the folks who have never listened.
It's very important. It's obvious to me. Of course, I have an advantage because I've actually observed Rusty in places like Blues Alley and a One Step Down. So I know that he has a personal relationship with a lot of the musicians that he's playing on the air. And since I know them, I also know that they hold you in high regard. They know you on a first name basis. So you can't have more credibility than that when the artists themselves come to town and they'll say, hey, how's that guy Rusty Hassan? To him lately? Mm-hmm. So there you go. I mean, you can't get any bigger recommendation than to have the artists themselves calling you by name.
And I think part of the magic of listening to Rusty on the radio is that he makes the artists real, and he eliminates the distance that can grow up between the music on the radio as an abstraction and the human input that goes into creating it. And his stories, again, he's a great curator. The stories highlight and illustrate why the music is important and why you should know about the artists and the context. He's really a great gift for the music and for the city.
You know, Blair, that's an excellent point you just raised there, because those of us who have an investment in this music we call jazz, like all of us do, we recognize the fact that for some of our peers and others, jazz music remains a mystery. You know, I'll never forget there was a late poet named Sekou Sundiata who operated in the jazz arena. And he had a poem where he talked about, one of the lines in his poem that stuck with me was where he talked about, as a kid, he wasn't into John Coltrane because he felt like you had to belong to something in order to be into John Coltrane. And you know, there are a lot of people new to this music or who haven't gotten to this music yet who feel like you have to feel intimidated, I guess, feel like you have to come to this music with a certain level of ownership or understanding or whatever. And, you know, Blair, you made good points about how someone like Rusty can help navigate those waters for certain people. You know, I mean, how does that happen? What are some of the kinds of things that you hear in Rusty's programming that help make the music more comfortable for others who are, you know, still kind of new to the music?
You know, he kind of sets the stage, and he does it sometimes by explaining the music, but often by the stories he tells about the artists and the personal stories. Or, you know, he'll say, well, then there was, I'm in the in crowd, and by the way, I was there that night. And
Right.
you know, it makes it real, and suddenly you can imagine what it was like in the caverns that night to be part of the in crowd. And he does it over and over and over again, and the stories humanize the music in a way that makes it accessible, and it's really, really important.
Davey?
I've always been amazed at the fact that there wasn't a genre or topic in jazz that he didn't have some personal experience with. And the extent of his memory. And I'm going to give you an example just from a photograph that I sent him that I found. And it's, you know, you got all kinds of photos in your house and you're picking up here. I know this thing was 30 years ago. And Rusty was in it, and it was in my backyard with a gathering. And when I sent it to him, he sent it back and told me what day it was and what was going on and who was in the picture. And I didn't remember all of it. I mean, there's some, and that's just again how he interlocks all generations, and so that when I need someone to draw the young folks in further to research names that they never heard, when they hear Rusty's interpretation, you can see it on their faces as oh this, you know, I need to check this out. And of course, I take him to a crowd of patrons who don't know much about jazz, and when they leave, they have an arsenal of things to go look for. He can quote what's the best direction or what's the best person to listen to get this style, to listen to that style. So it's, like I said, he's like the walking encyclopedia, the walking university of jazz.
Well, Ryan, I'm sure you have a favorite anecdote about your experiences with Rusty and knowing some of your fellow artists and introducing you to some of your fellow artists and that kind of thing?
Well, as I think back on it, I remember Rusty being present on so many nights when I was down at Blues Alley playing with Dizzy Gillespie. So many times I can't count, actually. And then, of course, I was the person who was hanging out at Blues Alley when I wasn't performing there. So I saw you down there when Sonny Rollins was playing. I saw you down there with Dexter Gordon. I saw you down there with McCoy Tyner, Freddie Hubbard, Stan Getz. Well, the list just goes on and on. So obviously you're a person who is a big fan. If I had to pick one instance that I would remember, I guess it would be us standing back there at the bar talking about what was happening on stage. I remember you and I back at the bar one night when Wynton Marsalis had changed the musical direction and had suddenly started playing old New Orleans music instead of maybe something out of the Wayne Shorter repertoire. You remember that?
Yes, I do. I do indeed. In fact, Ron, I remember even earlier, going back, as you said, to the 70s when Sonny Rollins was playing out at the Bird's Nest, Charlie Bird's Club out in Silver Spring. And
The Showboat Lounge.
Showboat, right. And you got to really make that connection with Rollins at that time. And he became a mentor of yours. In fact, you became entree to me to talk to Sonny Rollins over the years, which has been really special for me.
Yeah.
With Davey, going back again to the 70s, he and Esther were at Moore's Love and Peace on Rhode Island Avenue, not too far from my home, when I was broadcasting on Sunday afternoons on WAMU, but which catch Davey and Esther at Moore's, right down the street from where Bill Harris had his Pigfoot Club. And then in between those two clubs was Mr. Wise, so I had spots to go to on my way home from Blues Alley and the One Step Down.
Well, over the last 25 years or so, we've seen quite a shift in how listeners can access jazz in a broad radio universe. People like Rusty and myself operate in what's known as in radio as terrestrial radio, which is the standard AM and FM frequencies. We live in a world now where listeners can access a whole universe of opportunities by way of satellite radio, subscription music services like Pandora and Spotify and the like, and by way of the many web-based broadcasters out there. As you think about contributors to jazz radio like Rusty Hassan and what he and others bring to their programming that may differ from those other services, what's your sense of the importance of Rusty and his colleagues in so-called terrestrial radio, traditional radio?
Well, I think part of the importance is the sense of local community that grows out of terrestrial radio. It is bounded by place, and therefore there's a focus on community. And what makes Rusty interesting, I was thinking about this the other day. We're here talking about his role in the music scene, but Rusty's been involved in the community in lots of different ways. And I remember we were speaking about a decade ago at Busboys and Poets about the history of U Street. My book had just come out. And there I was, a historian, talking about what I had found. And there was Rusty talking about the lived experience. And I particularly remember that night because we both brought up the name of Marion Barry, and the audience erupted. And we just sat back and let the audience devour itself and over what the legacy of Marion Barry was. But what was important was Rusty remembered and participated in the stories of that time in DC. He was part of the history of the community that was here in the 60s, not just because of music, but because of his political interests, because of his broad connections. And I think that that notion of community is really something that is very important to what Rusty represents. And I think it comes out a little bit out of the kind of radio you're talking about.
Ron?
Um, I think it's important for somebody to have Rusty's perspective on worldwide radio these days, because it's important that people can pick up on the fact that he knows these people he's talking about, and he's heard them in live situations, and he's an actual fan. That's very important. It's important when you're reading a book. You like to feel like the person who's talking about the musicians actually has some kind of connection or relationship with the people he's talking about. And there's no doubt about Rusty. I've seen him at the bar talking to everybody that was on the stage. Everybody on the stage wound up at the bar, and you wound up talking to them, and that comes across. So that's very valuable, listening to jazz radio on the internet.
Davey?
In addition to that, DC doesn't know, when I say DC, I mean the total community doesn't know its jazz history, because a lot of it has not been documented. And there have been artists who have the same type of talent as your Charlie Parkers and Sonny Rollins and Ahmad Jamals, but that they are the ones that keep the music coming, or kept the music. They're the ones that produced myself, Ron, that those names are never heard, but when Rusty talks, he does talk about the community, and he brings up those names, and he tells his personal histories with them, as well as their history. That now is going worldwide. It actually gives the world an understanding that, yes, there's a lot of jazz that came out of DC, not the 3 or 4 names that they see or hear about, in other media sources.
I think each of you raised a very important point. And that is that while he's been in radio for over 50 years in this community, Rusty is not one of those so-called personality types. Although Rusty has done more than his share of emceeing major concert and festival activities, he's not what you would refer to as a radio personality. And I think that's important to consider, the fact that each of you have cited the fact that Rusty is a man of the people and a man of the jazz community. And I think that's important in terms of his longevity on the air here and his impact in radio. What would each of you say, just thinking about the fact that Rusty is someone who, if you walk in the Blues Alley on a given night, you're liable to see him sitting there at the bar. If you go to the Kennedy Center, you're liable to see Rusty at the concert. If you go to a festival, you go to Mid-Atlantic Jazz Festival or DC Jazz Fest, you'll see Rusty in there somewhere. If he's not emceeing, he's going to be there as a fan. He's not some guy who just shows up because he's a radio personality and he's getting a check to MC some concert as a personality. This is someone who is an enthusiast. What's your sense of the importance of the fact that not only is this someone who has who has his finger firmly on the pulse of the history of this music, but who's also an enthusiast of the music, and what that enthusiasm brings to his broadcasts?
makes you feel like you're listening to somebody who cares about the music, somebody who is an authority and can speak about the music historically. Like there's a difference between swing music and bebop, and someone like Rusty Hassan can actually address that and talk about the fact that the music embedded in jazz music are all the things that were happening in America sociologically. When there was a shift in how people felt about their lives in America, particularly Black people, the music changed along with their outlook on life, their outlook on their own lives in America. That's why you had bebop. All of those things help to underline the fact that we are now looking at ourselves differently than we did back in the 1930s and the early 1940s.
Blair, what's your sense of that?
Well, I absolutely. The story of jazz is a story of America, and people like Rusty make that clear. But I was thinking, as you a second ago when you were posing a question, Willard, I think what's true of Rusty, it's true of all of you, that you passionately care about what you do, and that passion comes through. With Ron and Davey, it comes through in the playing. With Willard and Rusty, it comes through in your devotion to the music. This, as you say, this isn't just about getting a check. He's not showing up because he's paid to be there. It's because when Rusty shows up, Rusty as a human being is showing up, and he cares passionately about what's happening. And he cares about the musicians he's talking to. And that just comes through everything that he does. And despite the fact that he's a rather low-key guy, you can just tell, in there is this love of what he's doing. And it makes in the arts, it makes all the difference.
Davey?
The word passion was in my mind just before Blair brought it up, but it's something about not just the passion for enjoying the art itself, but there's also a passion within him to share the joy that he gets from the art to other folks, because he says, if it makes me feel like this, I can help the world. and I think, myself, I'm grateful to be able to be participating in it, and also want to continue to participate in it. And I want to continue that blessing of being able to. I feel that same thing with Rusty, that he gets joy out of sharing the knowledge and the passion that he has for the art.
Well, now I want to turn the microphone on to our guest of honor, shall we say, our honoree for this conversation. And Rusty, tell us in a nutshell how you've developed through the years your philosophy of what you bring to the airways. These days on WPFW on Thursday evenings from 10 to midnight, how have you developed your programming through the years philosophically?
Well, I guess, radio really turned me on to the music. I was about 12 years old making a model airplane on a New Year's Day when some broadcaster played the Benny Goodman Carnegie Hall concert with a jam session that featured, along with Benny Goodman, Count Basie, Lester Young, Johnny Hodges, Cootie Williams, people from Basie's orchestra and Duke Ellington's orchestra. And that turned me on to the music. I was already somewhat familiar with jazz, and that was my first album that I picked up from Woolworths, and shifting from making model airplanes to buying jazz albums. And then going out to hear the music. My mom became familiar with what I was listening to. And she took me when I was about 13 to hear Lionel Hampton perform at a local high school. And then when I was in high school, I got to hear Dave Brubeck at Stanford High School. So I got turned on to the music through radio and through live performances. And it was really my ideal was kind of, well, I'd like to be a liner note writer, you know, like reading the back of the album covers to learn about the music. But when I came to Georgetown, it was very serendipitous. I was in a lunch counter place called Tea Hands, where I was sitting at a table drinking beer with a friend of mine, and somebody was ordering from the lunch counter and had jazz albums underneath his arms, and I wanted to check out what he had, and he was pretty hip. But he said he used the albums on his radio show on WGTB, the Georgetown University campus radio station, and that he had to give up the show to take a class. And he was impressed with my hipness, and he said, "Why don't you take over the show? So come on to the station next Monday, and I'll show you what to do, and you got it."
Wow.
It was very, very accidental that I got into radio. But I was on WGTV after I graduated as Vista volunteer. I was involved with a community organization called the New Thing Art and Architecture Center, which used to have jazz performances at St. Margaret's Church, and people like Shirley Horn and Andrew White would perform there. And the New Thing in 1969 got airtime on WAMU with me setting it up to do what was called the New Thing Root Music Show. And being on the airwaves on Sunday afternoon in the 70s and into the 80s on WAMU was you know, a great way of presenting music to an audience at a time when there were other stations playing this music and the artists were coming in through town. And I got to meet and talk with the artists at their performances. Someone named Norval Perkins, bought by Art Blakey on a Sunday afternoon when he was playing at Child Herald. And so Art spent a couple of hours on the show, but when I saw him that night and he's packing his drums in his car with John Hicks, and he's going to drive back to New York, and he's saying, "Hey, Rusty, where can I get something to eat?" It was easy for me to say, "Well, we have something to eat at my house, which is on your way out of town," you know. And as I was leading him to my house, driving in front of his station wagon, thinking, "Even so, Wuhena, my wife made a ham." And Art came in the house and looked in the fridge himself and said, "Oh, this is blue." And he tore into it, you know, and that developed, you know, a friendship with Art Blakey that you all were alluding to in terms of that personal connection. I feel really blessed to have met my heroes over the years.
Yeah.
I heard John Coltrane at Newport when I was 17, and again at the Bohemian Caverns when I was 19.
Oh man.
I was so intimidated, you know, in terms of the intensity of the music, that when John Coltrane walked past me, I was tongue-tied. Well, at the bar over the years in Blues Alley, I got to know and talk with McCoy Tyner. And when I told him that story, he laughed at me. He said, "John would have been very friendly to talk with. Just don't talk sports. It had to be music, you know, or other things, you know." And it was that kind of connection that really, you know, makes me feel special about the relationships. Some years ago, speaking of McCoy Tyner, at the predecessor to the DC Jazz Festival, I got to introduce McCoy Tyner to the audience at the Sylvan Theater. And I alluded to the fact that I first heard him when I was 17 with John Coltrane, you know, and never in my wildest dreams would I think I'd be on stage introducing him. A few weeks later, I got a homemade cardboard envelope sent to the WPFW with just McCoy Tyner written in the return address part. Opened it up, and it was a disc. I put the disc on the CD player, and I heard my voice. He sent me the concert.
Wow.
Now, how special is that for
Right.
McCoy Tyner to go through the effort of finding the address of WPFW and send me the recording of the concert that I said a few words to introduce him at?
Yeah.
That to me, makes me feel really, why I do this. That these are artists that people should know about, and that I made a connection with. Years ago, WPFW honored Sonny Rollins at a Jazz and Justice presentation at at the convention center.
Convention center. It was
Absolutely.
anniversary program. Yeah.
And I was a co-presenter to Rollins, and a week later I got a letter him thanking me for presenting the award to him. And
Yeah.
that to me, is so important in terms of the connection with these artists that should be known to a broader public in America. And for
So
me,
is that, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I've been really blessed to have known all these great artists as they are now passing on. The special relationship, Willard, that of what, because we were at his house at Stanley Cow, that he had that kind of connection with us, that he would invite us over for his holiday gatherings, and or Freddie Cole, who I would never miss at a performance at Blues Alley, because I first got to introduce him to an audience at Ed Murphy's Supper Club back in the 1970s on Georgia Avenue. No, I've been really blessed, in terms of getting to meet my heroes.
Well, I think that personal connection is very important, and the warmth of that personal connection that you have with so many artists comes out in your broadcasting. And folks, for those of you who are tuned into this broadcast, this DC Public Library broadcast, and we're so thankful for the library and for the DC Legendary Musicians for sponsoring this program. And we're in a different kind of arena these days with panel discussions like this. Were we not in pandemic times, I'm sure we'd be sitting at the library and sitting in front of an audience eager to ask questions. So we are at the point in such a discussion as this, a panel discussion, where we generally would call upon the audience and see if they have any questions. Given the fact that our audience is virtual for this particular program, I'll have to ask each of you gentlemen, do each of you, or do any of you have a question for Rusty Hassan?
Rusty, where do you think the DC jazz scene is heading?
During these pandemic times, it's really hard. We just saw one of our favorite spots close down, Alice's Jazz and Cultural Society, because DeAndre Howard just, couldn't maintain, the space with the environment right now. I am very, very hopeful that the live streaming that's been occurring to support places like Blues Alley or whatever can sustain the community. It's really distressing when you see, say, Twins Jazz no longer be presenting the artists that they presented over the last 2.5 decades. But we see PFW really maintaining itself on the airwaves. And I know Willard and I are both thankful that we keep the studio in pristine condition and we're able to do our broadcast in the studio in person to be able to present the music the way it should be presented. And one aspect that all of you have alluded to is that we have a strong community connection about Washington, D.C., but because of the streaming that also occurs from our broadcast, we're able to present Washington to the world at large, and make that connection globally, but keeping the focus on what's happening here in Washington. God knows I miss these panel discussions that we've been participating over the last couple of years with the rollout for DC Jazz, Stories of Jazz Music in Washington. But I'm really missing the interaction at live performances. What Jason Moran's done with the Kennedy Center for the last couple of years, now held in abeyance because of the pandemic. I'm really hopeful that all of this stuff once the virus subsides, that we can get back to really interacting with the live performances.
Davey, you around? Have any questions for Rusty?
I'm going to let Ron go first because I just spent the last 3 months with Rusty, and we interviewed him.
Right.
And I asked every question I could think of. And
Yes.
Well,
I have
pull up one of those questions for this audience.
I have 100 questions to ask you, Rusty, literally, but I know we don't have time. So one question that came to mind while you were talking, any ideas on how to jumpstart the scene once this pandemic is behind us?
We're getting back into, where things are happening. It's like, I know the DC Jazz Festival will be jump started because they've been maintaining a presence throughout this pandemic. The Mid-Atlantic Jazz Festival that Paul Carr will be doing online will certainly be jump starting back to getting the scene back together again. Those two festivals aren't specific location dependent the way some of the clubs are. Blues Alley is still hanging on, and hopefully once live performances are allowed, they'll be able to get back up to speed. A lot of the smaller clubs are probably going to, get back up. They need the support. We need to be really, really pushing it and saying, folks, get out and support the music now that you can be there.
Ron, or Davey, any further questions for Rusty?
We haven't talked about the relationship of Rusty. Sandra is a wonderful quilter. I've seen her work, and how a quilter and a jazz journalist came together.
Back in 1968, as a Vista volunteer, I was introduced to the new thing, Art and Architecture Center, as part of my community involvement through Vista. And there, working, with Topper Carew, was Sandy Barrett teaching African dance. She was part of Melvin Deal's African Heritage Dancers and Drummers. And also around that time, she was also making dresses and modeling. She was actually selling dresses and modeling for Rosemary Reed Miller at the Toast and Strawberries, African-American owned shop right off of Connecticut Avenue. And we met at the new thing. Topper Carew and his then partner, Betty Garman, who just passed away. Betty Garman Robinson, part of SNCC, part of the Civil Rights Movement. She and Topper and another friend of ours, Will Majors, all went out to see the Graduate. And after Chinese food and The Graduate, Sandy and I started living together, and we've been together ever since. This was around February of 1968. Wow. So we were together as the assassination of Martin Luther King resulted in the insurrection here in Washington, D.C. She'd already been involved with the Nonviolent Action Group, the SNCC component at Howard University. She was friends with Stokely Carmichael and Marion Barry and all of the folks that were involved in the movement at that time. So it was an entree to me to a lot of the movement folks also at that time, which connected with my Vista work. And her dressmaking evolved into, after we had our daughters in the 1970s, into making a quilt. And she evolved into working with other African-American quilter guilds, the Aruhu Quilter Guild, Daughters of Dorcas, and she just became such an artist that the Smithsonian African-American History and Culture Museum gift shop started purchasing her gifts, her quilts for the gift shop, the quilts and purses and other artifacts.
Wow.
which is now on hold, but her artistry continues.
Well, Rusty, thank you so much. And thanks to each of you for participating in this panel discussion. Thanks to Sandra Butler Truesdale for having us, and to Maggie Gilmore and the DC Public Library for hosting this. And I'd like to close by asking our honoree one quick question. Rusty Hassan, if a young person was to walk into your class today and ask you, what is the importance of jazz music, what would you tell them?
I would tell them that this music was rooted in the African American culture of America, and that it roots go back to precursors in spirituals, in work songs, in blues, and it became the creative art form of this country, and it's also music that can be entertaining and not to be intimidated by it. And in my first classes, I would play musical pieces that they may be familiar with to draw them into the music, playing things like Pink Panther or jazz interpretations of Killing Me Softly, or things that they may have been familiar with that they can now be drawn into the music. For me, having taught jazz history courses for about 35 or 40 years, it's always a thrill, including adult classes, non-credit classes, to have somebody come into me at a concert and say, I'm here because I learned about this music in your classroom, or I heard about this music on the radio. That to me is so important, to have drawn somebody to the music and help develop the audience for it.
And that certainly brings us back to our original premise, to celebrate the 50+ year jazz radio career of Rusty Hassan here in Washington metro area. And we are both volunteer radio programmers at WPFW. And I want folks to understand that we are not paid broadcasters. So for Rusty Hassan and for myself, this is a true labor of love. And I want to thank Blair Rubel, Davey Yarborough, Ron Holloway, and most especially our honoree, Rusty Hassan. And I want to turn it over to our host, Reverend Sandra Butler Truesdale, for a little bit of a benediction.
Got a good reverend. But I really wanted to just close by saying thank you to you cats. Y'all are just the best. I was thinking about how I met Davey Yarborough. You all don't know. Davey was a young man who walked into my office at the Board of Education. He was so involved in his music that he walked in to talk to me about funding for the jazz students at Duke Ellington. He doesn't probably remember that, but he did. And Ron Holloway was a friend of the El Corals and my good friend Carter Jefferson, we were raised across the street from each other. We called him Thumper. Nobody knows that, but the people who lived in that neighborhood, Carter Jefferson. So I wanted to thank Ron, and I also wanted to thank Blair. Blair was introduced to me by a lady named Kathy when he first started doing his book, and he's just been a dear friend now for maybe the past 5 or 10 years after I closed the gallery on 14th Street. But Rusty, I've been so impressed with Rusty because I met Rusty a long time ago at the Caverns when Ramsey Lewis was doing his recording. And I happened to be there and Rusty was there and I had the opportunity to meet him. There's another story about the new thing that I will tell him at another time. But I had a shop called The New Thing, and so did Papa Carew have The New Thing in Columbia Heights. And that's a whole different story.
Okay.
But I wanted to thank you all. You cats are so cool. I have been smiling through this whole interview. Thank you. And Rusty, thank you so much for all that you do for music and musicians, not just in Washington, D.C., but throughout the nation. And we all thank you.
I've been really blessed
Absolutely.
to be able to do it. I really have been.
And
It's been a
thank you.
pleasure for me.
Thank you to our viewers and listeners for tuning in.
And our interpreters as well.
Yes, indeed. And you can catch Rusty Hassan on Thursday nights from 10 until midnight at 89.3 FM in Washington and WPFWFM.org, streaming live online. Thank you, folks. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.